Faith was the only passport millions of people needed in medieval Europe. The epic pilgrimages these travelers undertook did far more than save their souls. They forged the very spiritual and political maps of a continent. Saint Augustine once wrote that the world is a book, and those who do not travel read only one page. This journey uncovers the lost chronicles of those who read the entire volume. You will discover how dusty paths to Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela became the arteries of Europe, pumping pilgrims, ideas, and power across the land. We will see how these sacred routes sparked economic revolutions, planted the seeds of international law, and built the foundations for modern diplomacy. What invisible force could turn a simple footpath into a channel for kings and commerce? How did a walk across a continent help to build our world? What would you be willing to walk 1,000 miles to find? The dirt path leading from his village was the only world he had ever known. Yet here he was, a 9th-century farmer, leaving his fields behind, guided by nothing more than a dream and a desperate faith. For him, this was not a journey but a transformation. The medieval pilgrimage was a profound act of devotion, a physical penance for spiritual debts, and for some, a rare chance to step beyond the rigid boundaries of their birth. This voluntary exile split into 3 distinct paths. Local pilgrimages sought a nearby saint's shrine for a quick miracle. Regional journeys might take weeks to a national holy site. But the epic journeys, the grand projects of a lifetime, were reserved for the 3 great centers of Christendom: Jerusalem, where Christ walked; Rome, the seat of St. Peter; and Santiago de Compostela, in far-off Spain, where the Apostle James was said to be buried. Historian Diana Webb reminds us that pilgrimage was the most extensive voluntary movement of people in the Middle Ages. Think of that scale. This was not a trickle of the pious but a river of humanity, all moved by powerful theological ideas. They practiced imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, by suffering and wandering as he had. They sought the intercessory power of saints, believing that physical proximity to a sacred relic, a bone or a fragment of cloth, could channel divine grace. Some walked as penance, ordered by a priest to atone for a sin. Others hoped for a miracle, a cure for an illness that no earthly physician could treat. And for those who returned, the social prestige was immense. They were no longer just a baker or a blacksmith. They were a peregrinus, a person who had been to sacred lands. Their stories and their very identity forever changed. Centuries earlier, the Venerable Bede meticulously recorded the journeys of early English pilgrims to Rome, preserving their names and their purpose. Their travels were already considered feats worthy of history, so what force could be that compelling? What would make you leave your home, your family, everything familiar, to walk 1,000 miles into the unknown, facing bandits, disease, and starvation? It was this potent mixture of faith, fear, and hope that first set millions of feet in motion, creating the desire for a path. Next, we must see how that desperate desire began to carve permanent roads across a continent. The sheer scale of the human river flowing towards Rome was a spectacle in itself. Pilgrims from the misty shores of England, the bustling ports of Flanders, and the distant villages of Hungary all converged on a single destination, their feet tracing the deep ruts of the Via Francigena. This was not merely a road, it was a direct channel for the power of the papacy, stretching its influence from the heart of Italy deep into northern Europe. As Pope Innocent III would later observe, just as the streams flow from the mountains to the sea, so do the peoples flow to Rome, and this constant flow of humanity was the lifeblood of the city's authority. Upon arrival, the pilgrim's journey was meticulously mapped by the church itself. they would visit the great basilicas, St. Peter's, St. John Lateran, and others, performing specific prayers and rituals at each holy station. For this spiritual labor, the Church granted a powerful reward, an indulgence, which was a remission of the temporal punishment for their sins. This system transformed a physical journey into a quantifiable spiritual benefit, a brilliant mechanism that reinforced Rome as the indispensable center of Christian grace. But this was not just a spiritual transaction, it was a profound political statement. The arrival of a powerful ruler in Rome was the ultimate act of fealty. Consider the Anglo-Saxon King Caedwalla, who, after a brutal reign, abdicated his throne and traveled all the way to Rome to be baptized by the Pope himself. His baptism and subsequent death there was a powerful symbol, demonstrating that even a king's ultimate spiritual authority was tied to the Holy See. German emperors made the arduous trek to be crowned by the Pope, a ceremony that visually represented the complex dance between spiritual and secular power. And with the pilgrims came wealth, a steady stream of donations and tribute that funded the magnificent art and architecture that made Rome a beacon of Christendom. The pilgrimage to Rome was therefore a self-reinforcing cycle. Faith brought the people, their devotion cemented papal authority, and that authority attracted the powerful, whose presence and wealth further magnified the city's glory. Yet for all its grandeur, Rome was still a stepping stone. Beyond it lay a journey of even greater danger and an even more potent promise, the path to the very city where heaven had touched earth. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont and thundered a call that would echo for centuries. He urged the knights of Europe to stop warring amongst themselves and to instead take up the cross, to embark on an armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem from its rulers. This was not just a sermon, it was a spark that lit a continent on fire. The journey to Jerusalem, known as the Iter Hierosolomitanum, instantly became the ultimate quest, the most dangerous and prestigious pilgrimage imaginable. Historian Jonathan Riley Smith observed that the desire to pray at the sites of Christ's life was a powerful force that could mobilize armies. This was the pilgrimage's dual heart. For the individual, it was the pinnacle of personal devotion, a chance to walk where Jesus walked. For Christendom, it became a catalyst for massive geopolitical events, the Crusades, that redrew the map of the Mediterranean world. The pilgrim had two terrible choices for this journey. The land route meant a grueling march through the Balkans and into Anatolia, a landscape fraught with bandits, scarce supplies, and the constant threat of hostile powers. The sea route from Italian ports like Venice and Genoa was faster but brought its own nightmares, the perils of autumn storms, shipwreck, and pirates. To survive this, pilgrims needed more than faith, they needed a system. This desperate need gave rise to one of the most famous institutions of the age, the Knights Hospitaller. These warrior monks swore to protect and care for pilgrims, establishing hospices and hospitals along the route. They were the first international aid organization, a direct response to the violent chaos of the Pilgrim Trail. The German monk Bernard the Wise left a detailed account of his own journey in the 9th century, describing the complex bureaucracy of the Holy Land, the special permits needed from local authorities, and the guides required to navigate a landscape as politically treacherous as it was spiritually profound. For those who survived, the spiritual reward was immeasurable, but the consequences of this mass movement stretched far beyond individual salvation. The Crusader states established in the Levant became a Europe abroad, strange feudal kingdoms perched on the edge of Asia. And as pilgrims and crusaders traveled back and forth, they carried more than relics. They brought back silks, spices, and most importantly, knowledge, from advanced mathematics to classical texts long lost to the West. This flow of goods and ideas would help awaken Europe from its centuries-long slumber. If such extreme devotion could forge new worlds in the East, what kind of power was being harnessed along the Great Pilgrim Road forming on the western edge of the continent? The sound of bagpipes signaled the final stretch, a haunting melody greeting exhausted travelers as they caught their first glimpse of the cathedral spires. For those walking the Camino de Santiago, this was the end of a journey of hundreds of miles, but for the kingdoms of Spain, it was just the beginning of a much larger project. The pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James did far more than save souls. It became a powerful weapon in the long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula. This was the era of the Reconquista, and the legend of Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer, was born on the battlefield. Tales spread that the apostle himself, mounted on a white horse, would descend from heaven to fight alongside Christian armies. This was not just a spiritual story, it was a brilliant political narrative, a call to arms that galvanized knights from across Europe to travel to Spain not only as pilgrims but as warriors, their faith and their swords serving the same cause. As one medieval guidebook proudly declared, the four great pilgrimages are to Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago, and the Shrine of St. Thomas in India. This placed a remote corner of Spain on the world stage, making it a destination worthy of kings. The routes they walked, especially the great Camino Francais stretching from the Pyrenees, were the arteries of this new Spain. The French monastic order of Cluny became the pilgrimage's greatest champion, establishing monasteries and hospices along the way. These religious houses were not only spiritual refuges, they were strategic outposts that secured the land, encouraged repopulation, and cultivated the fields that fed the endless stream of travelers. The road itself began to transform. Towns like Burgos and Leon flourished, their wealth built on serving the needs of pilgrims. A new, international Spain was emerging in the north, its culture and economy forged by the constant flow of people. We can hear the voices of those pilgrims even today in the Codex Calixtinus, a 12th century guidebook that is part devotional manual and part rough travelogue. It praises the virtues of the Basque people, warns of rivers with fish that can kill you, and cautions against unscrupulous innkeepers who would cheat a weary traveler. This was the reality of the Camino, a communal journey that mixed the sublime with the mundane. And at the end of the road stood the great cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, a masterpiece of Romanesque architecture whose very stones were paid for by the devotion of millions. This constant movement of people, money, and ideas along the Camino was not an isolated phenomenon. It was a preview of a much wider economic revolution that these epic journeys were about to unleash across the entire continent. A small village along the Via Francigena might have started with a single ford across a river, a place where travelers naturally paused. Soon, an enterprising local would set up a stall selling bread and ale. Then came a blacksmith to shoe weary horses and a carpenter to repair wagon wheels. Within a generation, that simple ford could blossom into a bustling market town, its entire existence and wealth built upon the endless river of pilgrims. This was pilgrimage as Europe's first great tourism industry, a powerful economic engine that fundamentally reshaped the continent's physical and financial landscape. The need to move millions of people safely and efficiently demanded a vast new infrastructure. Kings and bishops, recognizing both spiritual merit and financial gain, funded the construction of durable stone bridges, the clearing and paving of roads, and the establishment of a network of hospitals and hostels. These were not just acts of charity, they were strategic investments in the continent's first integrated transit system. Economic historian Robert Lopez famously termed this transformation the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, and the pilgrimage was its pulsating heart. Entire new towns, known as bastides or villeneuves, were deliberately founded at strategic points along the major routes, their street grids laid out to channel pilgrims directly past market stalls and inns. Older cities like Leon on the Camino or Canterbury on the road to Rome saw their fortunes soar, their economies retooled to serve the pilgrim trade. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. Better infrastructure attracted more pilgrims, and more pilgrims generated the wealth needed to build even better infrastructure. The economic activities that sprouted along these paths were remarkably modern. Pilgrims needed to buy food, pay for lodging, and have their clothes mended. They sought out moneychangers to convert their foreign currency, and they hired local guides to navigate treacherous mountain passes, and they all wanted souvenirs. The sale of lead or pewter badges depicting the symbol of a shrine like the scalloped shell of Santiago became a massive industry. To wear such a badge was proof of your journey, a sacred status symbol. This need for reliable financial services gave rise to Europe's first international banking families, such as the Lombards from northern Italy. They established branches along the pilgrim routes, allowing a traveler to deposit funds in London and withdraw them in Rome using a letter of credit. This innovation reduced the risk of carrying coin and helped standardize currencies, greasing the wheels of long-distance trade for centuries to come. Nowhere is this economic miracle more visible than in the French town of Conques. Nestled in a remote valley, Conques was not on any major Roman road. Its entire reason for being was the pilgrimage. The abbey there acquired the relics of Saint Foy, a young martyr, and through a combination of pious promotion and what some might call holy theft, it drew a flood of pilgrims. The wealth from their offerings, from the sale of badges and the renting of rooms, funded the construction of the magnificent Abbey Church of Saint Foy, a breathtaking masterpiece of Romanesque architecture that stands as a monument not just to faith, but to the sheer economic power of devotion. Yet this relentless flow of people and wealth carried with it something even more transformative than coin, a parallel current of ideas, art, and knowledge that would begin to stitch a fragmented continent back together. A scholar from England and a theologian from Italy could never have met in their homelands, yet they found themselves hunched over a single manuscript in a pilgrim's hostel in Leon, their debate fueled by a shared journey. The roads to Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago were not just paths for the faithful. They were Europe's first intellectual internet, a sprawling network where knowledge traveled at the speed of a walking person. This constant, unpredictable mingling of people from every corner of the continent and beyond ignited an intellectual revival so profound we call it the 12th century Renaissance. It was the pilgrim, the scholar, and the merchant all moving along the same sacred tracks who carried the seeds of this new learning. The philosopher John of Salisbury, who himself walked to Rome, captured this perfectly when he wrote that we are like dwarfs perched on the shoulders of giants. He understood that knowledge is cumulative, built by each generation, and in his time the pilgrimage routes were the very ladders that allowed thinkers to climb up and see further. Much of this new vision came through the gateways of Spain. As pilgrims trekked to Santiago de Compostela, they entered a world where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim cultures coexisted. In the great libraries of cities like Toledo, teams of translators were busy at work, rendering ancient Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. A single traveler could change the course of European thought. Consider Adelard of Bath, an English scholar who posed as a pilgrim to travel to Sicily and the Crusader states. When he returned home, he brought with him Arabic translations of Euclid's geometry and crucial astronomical tables, texts that would become the foundation for science in the West for centuries. This flood of new knowledge did not just stay in books, it shaped the very world pilgrims walked through. Architectural ideas flowed as easily as people. The robust, rounded arches of the Romanesque style, seen in the great pilgrimage churches like Saint Sernin in Toulouse or the Cathedral of Santiago itself, became a visual language of faith that stretched from Italy to the Atlantic. Later, the soaring, heaven-pointing lines of the Gothic style would travel north from France along the same roads, carried by masons and abbots who had seen the latest marvels. And in the bustling marketplaces and crowded hostels, a more practical kind of wisdom was being forged, the beginnings of international law. How should a French knight be judged if he wrongs a German merchant on the road to Rome? What rights did a pilgrim have when passing through a foreign lord's territory? The constant interaction of diverse peoples, all under the theoretical protection of the Church, forced the creation of common standards and legal concepts that transcended local borders. This cross-pollination of cultures extended even to the words on their tongues as the languages of the road began to blend and evolve. That shared meal in a pilgrim's hostel was a symphony of accents, a jumble of Latin, French, and German patched together with gestures and goodwill. In these moments on the roads to Santiago or Rome, something profound was being woven, a shared European cultural identity that began to soften the hard edges of local loyalties. A common currency was emerging, and it was not just silver coin. As the historian Peter Brown observed, the cult of saints created a common currency of the supernatural across the continent. The same stories of St. James in Spain or St. Martin in France were told in churches from Poland to Portugal, their images carved in a familiar, standardized style that any pilgrim would recognize. This was the beginning of a homogenization of culture driven by millions of footsteps. This shared experience was guided by a common literature. The Pilgrim's Guide from the Codex Calixtinus was more than a travelogue, it was a cultural script. A knight from Germany and a merchant from Flanders, both clutching copies, would share the same expectations, be warned of the same treacherous rivers, and seek out the same holy shrines along the Camino. On the long marches, they would sing the same epic songs, like the Chanson de Roland, its tales of heroic sacrifice against impossible odds, reinforcing a chivalric ideal that resonated across all of Christendom. This concept of Christianitas, a unified spiritual civilization standing against external threats, was not an abstract idea preached from a pulpit. It was a feeling forged on the road, in the company of strangers who became comrades, all united by a single sacred goal. The very clothes they wore told this story of unity. A pilgrim returning from Canterbury would be adorned with a badge depicting St. Thomas Becket's martyrdom, while one from Santiago would display the distinctive scallop shell. These were more than souvenirs, they were a visual language instantly understood by everyone from Italy to England, signaling a shared journey and a shared status. This emerging collective identity, however, was fragile. It was constantly tested by the brutal realities of the journey. That same German knight and Flemish merchant, bound by song and prayer one day, might find themselves in a bitter dispute over a place to sleep or a stolen purse the next. The unity of the road was a delicate truce, perpetually negotiated between the ideal of a universal Christendom and the very human instincts of suspicion and survival. Yet this constant friction between unity and division on the pilgrim trails was a training ground for something even larger, a new way for kingdoms to interact beyond the battlefield. The mountain pass was silent, save for the wind and the groans of the dying. A chronicler tells of a pilgrim band ambushed there, stripped of their clothes and coins, left naked and broken upon the stones. Their road to salvation had ended in a frozen ditch. For all its spiritual glory, the pilgrimage was a brutal confrontation with mortality, a journey where faith was tested not just by devotion, but by bandits, disease, and the cruel deceptions of men. The dangers began the moment a traveler stepped beyond their village boundary. Wild animals still haunted the dark forests of Europe, and a sudden storm in the Alps could sweep an entire party from a narrow ledge. Yet the most persistent threats were human. Robbers haunted every lonely stretch of road, preying on the weak and the isolated. Unscrupulous innkeepers were infamous for watering down wine, serving rotten food, or even conspiring with local thieves to rob their sleeping guests. Geoffrey Chaucer captured this fragile existence in his Canterbury Tales, writing, "The life so short, the craft so long to learn." His line speaks to the immense difficulty of any great undertaking, especially one where life itself was the price of a single misstep. Disease was a constant, silent companion. Pilgrims crowded into filthy hostels were perfect vectors for plague. Dysentery, known then as the bloody flux, could strike down a healthy traveler in days, leaving them dehydrated and helpless by the roadside, their sacred goal forever out of reach. And then there were the scams, a spiritual marketplace preying on desperation. Charlatans sold fake relics, passing off chicken bones as the finger of a saint, or offering pieces of the one true cross that, if gathered together, would have built a small forest. Ferrymen demanded exorbitant sums to cross a river, knowing pilgrims had no other choice. This relentless hardship took a deep psychological toll. A pilgrim far from home, sick and penniless, could easily be consumed by a profound homesickness or a crippling doubt, wondering if God had abandoned them on this desolate path. The sheer scale of this suffering is tragically embodied by the Children's Crusade of 1212. Thousands of young people, believing in a pure faith that could move mountains, set out for the Holy Land. They possessed no weapons, only a belief that the Mediterranean Sea would part for them. It did not. Most perished from hunger and disease, and many of the survivors were betrayed, sold into slavery, their innocent faith extinguished by a brutal world. It was this ever-present shadow of violence, deception, and death that made the pilgrimage so perilous, and which makes the incredible protective systems that eventually arose to safeguard these travelers one of the most lasting and practical legacies of the entire age. That lantern in the monastery gatehouse was more than a light, it was a promise of survival. After days of trudging through mud and fear, the sight meant a warm meal, a safe place to sleep, and perhaps even a salve for bleeding feet. This sacred welcome was the very engine of the pilgrimage, a continent-spanning safety net woven by monastic orders who saw every traveler as a stand-in for Christ himself. Their rule was clear: all guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ. This was not a suggestion, it was a divine command that built the first true hospitality network Europe had ever seen. Along the great routes, abbeys and priories were strategically spaced, often a day's walk apart, creating a chain of refuge. The Cluniac monks were masters of this system, not only offering shelter but actively maintaining the roads and building the sturdy stone bridges that made the journey possible. The Augustinian canons, meanwhile, dedicated themselves to running hospices directly, their lives organized around the care of strangers. Inside these shelters, the routine was one of humble charity. A pilgrim would be given water to wash their feet, a simple but profound act of service, then led to a large, open dormitory filled with straw pallets. A basic meal of bread, pottage, and perhaps a cup of ale would follow, offered for free or for a voluntary donation. For those who were ill or injured, there was the hospital, a separate infirmary where monastic brothers and sisters provided what care they could. This might include herbal remedies, setting broken bones, or simply offering a clean space to rest, which was often the greatest medicine of all. the entire operation depended on a sophisticated economic foundation. Wealthy nobles seeking spiritual merit endowed these institutions with lands and annual incomes, ensuring a steady supply of food and funds. Women's convents played a vital and often overlooked role in this sacred work, with nuns personally tending to the sick and managing the logistics of feeding dozens of unexpected guests each night. The architecture itself was designed for this purpose. The Great St. Bernard Hospice, perched high in the treacherous Alps, stands as the ultimate example. Founded in the 11th century by St. Bernard of Menthon, its thick walls have shielded countless pilgrims from blizzards and avalanches for nearly 1,000 years. Its famous dogs, bred to locate lost travelers in the snow, are a living symbol of its unwavering mission. This sacred hospitality was the indispensable counterpart to the roads and bridges, the human heart within the continent's new circulatory system. It was this very safety, however imperfect, that allowed not just people to move, but their most precious and fragile cargo to travel with them, the ideas that were quietly remaking the world. The great stone arches of the bridge at Puente la Reina stand as a silent testament to a continent's devotion. In the heart of Navarre, this majestic span was not built for a local lord or a military campaign. It was constructed for one purpose alone: to carry pilgrims safely across the river Arga on their way to Santiago de Compostela. This bridge, and countless others like it, represents one of the most tangible legacies of the pilgrimage, a massive investment in civil engineering inspired by faith. Building and maintaining the roads, bridges, and tunnels that made these epic journeys possible was seen not as a civic duty, but as a profound act of piety in itself. A medieval chronicler, praising a bishop for such work, wrote that he built a bridge as a work of piety for travelers and pilgrims. This sentiment was shared by kings, queens, and commoners alike, who poured their wealth into projects that tamed the wild landscapes of Europe for the sake of the soul. The famous Pont Saint-Bénézet, the Bridge of Avignon, was begun in the 12th century after a young shepherd boy named Bénez. It claimed to have received a divine vision commanding him to build it. His faith reportedly gave him the strength to lift the foundation stones, inspiring the entire community to contribute to a structure that would stand for centuries. This blend of miraculous legend and hard, practical necessity was the driving force behind this infrastructure revolution. The financing for these monumental undertakings was as innovative as the engineering itself. Wealthy patrons donated vast sums to earn spiritual merit, while the church often granted indulgences, remissions of penance, to those who contributed money or labor. Tolls collected from merchants and travelers using the new bridges provided a steady income for their upkeep, creating a self-sustaining system. To manage this, specialized guilds and brotherhoods were formed, dedicated solely to the maintenance of a specific bridge or a dangerous stretch of road. These were the first public works departments, their members motivated by a mix of civic pride and religious zeal. The physical safety of pilgrims was so important that it even reshaped legal concepts. Along certain routes, the king's peace was explicitly extended to travelers, making an attack on a pilgrim not just a local crime, but an offense against the crown itself. This created protected corridors of travel where the rule of law was stronger than the whim of a local bandit lord. These tangible networks of stone and mortar, however, were only one side of the story. They were the physical expression of a far more complex and intangible network that was also being woven across the continent, a web of power, diplomacy, and emerging statecraft that would ultimately change the very nature of Europe. A king walking the same dusty roads as his poorest subject was a sight of profound power. When a monarch like Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, embarked on a crusade to the Holy Land, he was not merely a pilgrim, he was a nation on the move. His journey was a grand performance of piety, a political statement written in the language of faith, designed to solidify his rule at home and project his influence abroad. For rulers, the pilgrimage was a unique tool of statecraft, a way to atone for political sins, forge crucial alliances, and demonstrate their divine right to lead. The Anglo-Danish king Canute the Great made this clear in his own pilgrimage to Rome. He did not go only to pray, he went to negotiate directly with the Pope, successfully securing lower fees for English archbishops traveling to receive their palliums. This was high-stakes diplomacy wrapped in the cloak of devotion. As one royal biographer notes, a king's pilgrimage displayed his piety to his subjects and his peers, enhancing his prestige in a world where spiritual authority and political power were two sides of the same coin. The motivations for these royal journeys were as complex as the kings themselves. Some, like King Henry II of England, undertook pilgrimages as public penance for grievous crimes, walking barefoot to Canterbury after the murder of Thomas Becket to atone for his role in the archbishop's death. Others launched crusades, using the call to liberate Jerusalem as a way to expand their influence into the Mediterranean and unite their fractious nobles under a common, holy cause. And for many, the simple act of being seen as a devout Christian ruler was enough, a vital source of legitimacy in an uncertain world. The logistics of a royal pilgrimage were a monumental undertaking. This was not a solitary quest, it was the movement of an entire court. A king traveled with a vast entourage of knights, clerics, servants, and diplomats, a mobile capital that required feeding, housing, and protecting across hundreds of miles. This immense caravan became a rolling summit, with political meetings occurring at monasteries and castles along the route, where alliances were forged and treaties were whispered. Gifts were a crucial currency, with kings making lavish donations to shrines and churches, not only to earn spiritual merit but to cement political relationships with powerful bishops and abbots. The stakes of these sacred journeys could alter the fate of empires. Consider the pilgrimage of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, known as Barbarossa. His journey to the Holy Land during the Third Crusade was the ultimate expression of a ruler's holy duty. Yet his mysterious death by drowning in a river in Anatolia threw his empire into chaos, dramatically shifting the balance of power in Europe and leaving the crusade without its most formidable leader. In this way, the personal faith of the powerful was inextricably linked with the destiny of nations, a connection that was also being forged, in quieter but no less significant ways, by the common people who walked beside them. The pilgrim's tunic was a disguise of divine simplicity. For a serf bound to his lord's soil, this coarse garment and a simple wooden staff were more than religious symbols, they were tools of liberation. The rigid feudal world, where your place was fixed from birth, was temporarily suspended on the sacred road. Here, under the protection of the pilgrim's peace, a count and a carpenter could walk side by side, sharing food and stories, their worldly status blurred by a shared higher purpose. As one medieval sermon powerfully declared, in the eyes of God, the pilgrim knows no rank. This was a radical notion in a society built on hierarchy. The legal framework made this possible. Pilgrims carried letters of safe conduct, documents that placed them under the direct protection of the church or a king. An attack on a pilgrim was not just a local crime, it was a sin against God and an offense against the crown, a concept that offered a fragile but powerful shield against the whims of local lords. For those lords, this was a genuine problem. The pilgrimage drained their estates of vital labor, as peasants legally petitioned for leave to undertake their spiritual journey. Some never returned, using the anonymity of the road to escape their old lives entirely and find a new beginning in a distant town. This mobility was especially transformative for women. In a world that confined them to the domestic sphere, pilgrimage offered a rare path to public life and personal authority. Consider Marjorie Kemp, a 15th century Englishwoman and mother of 14. After a series of visions, she embarked on pilgrimages across Europe and to the Holy Land. Dressed in white as a sign of her spiritual marriage to Christ, she wept and preached publicly, openly challenging clerical authorities who doubted her. Her book, the first autobiography in English, is a testament to the voice pilgrimage could grant to someone otherwise silenced. This social fluidity on the road was a quiet revolution. It did not overthrow feudalism in a day, but it introduced a powerful idea that identity was not always fixed, that a person could be remade through a journey. The footsteps of millions were not just wearing down stone paths, they were slowly eroding the very foundations of a static society, creating a world where the story of a single life could become a chronicle for the ages. The scratch of a quill on parchment was the pilgrim's final act of devotion. In the flickering candlelight of a monastery guesthouse or a crowded inn, these travelers did more than just walk. They wrote, etching their experiences into records that would outlive them by centuries. These pilgrimage narratives are the ground-level chronicles of the Middle Ages, a sprawling library of personal testimonies that offer us a window into a world in motion. They range from dry, practical itineraries, essentially the roadmaps of their day, listing the distances between towns and the best places to find clean water, to vivid, emotional memoirs filled with awe, frustration, and spiritual revelation. As one modern historian puts it, these texts are our windows onto the medieval mind and its perception of the world. They show us not just where people went, but how they felt about what they saw. One of the very first of these accounts comes from a remarkable 4th century nun named Egeria. Her itinerarium, a long letter to her sisters back home, describes her pilgrimage to the Holy Land with breathtaking detail. She does not just note the biblical sites, she captures the living liturgy of Jerusalem, the chanting of psalms at dawn, and the overwhelming emotion of standing in a place she had only ever read about in Scripture. Centuries later, a very different kind of book captivated Europe, The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. This was a fantastical compilation, a patchwork of real traveler reports and pure imagination, describing men with faces in their chests and rivers of jewels. It was often more fiction than fact, yet its influence was immense, shaping how an entire continent imagined the lands beyond Christendom. So why did they write? Some wrote to guide future pilgrims, creating practical manuals for survival. Others wrote to boast, to prove they had completed the ultimate journey and earned the social prestige that came with it. And many wrote to process a profound spiritual transformation, to make sense of an experience that had shaken them to their core. The Irish monk Simon Semionis left one of the most wonderfully detailed diaries from the 14th century. On his way to the Holy Land, he did not just record prayers, he noted the price of figs in Crete, described the strange sight of a giraffe in Alexandria, and sketched the bewildering architecture of Cairo, giving us a tourist's eye view of the medieval world. Common themes bind these diverse accounts, a mixture of marvels at foreign customs, stark complaints about hardships like bad food and treacherous guides, and a deep undercurrent of devotional fervor. These written records do more than inform us about geography and politics. They reveal the enduring symbols pilgrims carried not in their packs, but in their minds, a shared mental map of a world that was both terrifying and wondrous. This flood of personal testimony created a new kind of authority, one based on direct experience rather than ancient texts, quietly empowering the individual voice in an age of dogma. Each lead badge on a pilgrim's cloak was a hard-won medal. These small, mass-produced tokens depicting the Veronica veil from Rome or the keys of St. Peter were more than simple trinkets. They were a visual resume of a lifetime's devotion, a portable identity that announced your spiritual accomplishments to everyone you met. A medieval writer perfectly captured this when he noted that pilgrims carry signs of their journeys on their bodies and their clothes. This was the birth of a powerful material culture where faith became something you could wear. The most iconic of all was the scallop shell of Santiago de Compostela. A pilgrim who had walked the hundreds of miles to the cathedral in Spain would sew this shell onto their hat or their bag. It was the ultimate status symbol, instantly recognizable across the continent. Similarly, a pilgrim returning from Jerusalem would carry a palm frond, earning them the title of palmer, a distinction of the highest order. Acquiring these tokens was a sacred ritual in itself. Upon reaching a major shrine, a pilgrim would present themselves to the church authorities, make an offering, and then purchase their official badge from a stall controlled by the cathedral. This was not a free market. The church maintained a strict monopoly on the production and sale of these souvenirs, ensuring their authenticity and generating a significant income. The belief in the power of these objects went far beyond social boasting. They were thought to be imbued with the sacred power of the site itself, carrying a fragment of the saint's grace. Pilgrims genuinely believed a badge from Canterbury depicting the martyrdom of Thomas Becket could offer protection on the road or even bring about healing. This belief is vividly illustrated by the widespread use of ampullae. These were small, flask-shaped containers made of lead or tin, often decorated with images of the saint. Pilgrims would fill them with holy water or oil from the lamps burning at the shrine, then wear them around their necks. They were considered a kind of spiritual medicine, a portable source of divine power to be used in times of illness or danger. The social cachet these objects carried back home was immense. A villager returning with a cloak full of badges was no longer just a farmer. They were a witness to the wider world, a person of experience and piety whose stories would be listened to with rapt attention. These souvenirs were also used as votive offerings, pinned to altars in local churches as a permanent thank you to God for a safe return. The sheer scale of this industry is confirmed by archaeology. Thousands of these lead badges have been unearthed not at the shrines themselves, but along the routes and in distant hometowns, lost or discarded by travelers centuries ago. The trade was so lucrative that it spawned a black market in fakes, leading the church to issue strict regulations against the sale of counterfeit relics and badges. This entire economy of devotion, from the official scallop shell to the humble ampulla, reveals a profound truth. The pilgrimage was not just an internal, spiritual journey. It was a physical transformation made visible, a story told in lead and shell that long after the pilgrims' footsteps had faded, their sacred souvenirs continued to speak. The cool, damp air of the cathedral was a shock after the sun-baked road. Inside, the only light fell from high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing above a crowd of silent, waiting pilgrims. Each person's journey culminated in this single, solemn transaction, approaching the high altar not just to see a saint's bones, but to receive a piece of parchment, a written indulgence that promised something more valuable than any earthly treasure, a remission of the punishment awaiting them for their sins. This was the heart of the medieval economy of salvation, a spiritual marketplace where grace was quantified and pilgrimage was the price. The theological engine of this system was the doctrine of purgatory, a temporary state of purification for souls who died in God's grace but were not yet pure enough for heaven. The suffering there was understood as temporal punishment, a debt to divine justice that remained even after a sin was forgiven. An indulgence was not forgiveness itself that required true repentance, but rather an official pardon from the Church, drawn from its so-called treasury of merit that could wipe away this temporal debt. A pilgrimage to a specific shrine, especially on a major feast day, could earn a pilgrim a plenary indulgence, a full remission of all punishment owed. A papal bull from the 13th century explicitly outlines the conditions, stating that all who are truly penitent and have confessed their sins, and who shall visit the basilica of the Prince of the Apostles, shall obtain pardon for all their sins. This promise linked spiritual benefit directly to physical travel, transforming a long walk into a celestial transaction. This entire economy depended on the tangible power of relics. These physical objects, a saint's finger bone, a piece of the true cross, a drop of the Virgin's milk, were believed to be conduits of divine grace, charged with holy power. The presence of a major relic made a church a spiritual power station, and cities competed fiercely for them. Theft was even considered a pious act, known as furta sacra, or holy theft, where monks would rescue relics from a less worthy location to bring them to their own abbey, a practice that could instantly transform an obscure monastery into a major pilgrimage center. Yet this system of calculated spiritual rewards had its critics. Theologians like John Wycliffe in England began to question the very premise, arguing that God's grace could not be bought or sold with a journey or a coin. He saw the trade in indulgences and relics as a corruption, a human invention that placed a barrier between the believer and God. The public ceremonies designed to attract pilgrims only fueled this criticism. Church officials would proclaim the granting of new indulgences from the steps of cathedrals, detailing the spiritual rewards on offer in a spectacle that could feel more like a market fair than a divine summons. The ultimate expression of this spiritual economy was the Jubilee year, instituted by Pope Boniface VIII in the year 1300. He declared that any Christian who made a pilgrimage to Rome in that year, confessing their sins and visiting the designated basilicas, would receive a plenary indulgence. The result was an unprecedented human flood. Chroniclers describe the city so packed with pilgrims that guards had to be posted to manage the crowds crossing the Tiber, and the offerings were so vast that 2 clerics were said to rake the money piled on the altar of St. Peter's. The promise of a clean spiritual slate was a force powerful enough to move millions, but this very power contained a dangerous contradiction, a friction between the purity of faith and the mechanics of its reward that would one day shake the foundations of Europe itself. Yet even as the cathedrals rose higher, a quiet dissent began to murmur in the town squares and country lanes. A dissenting preacher might stand before a growing crowd and declare that God dwells not in stone churches but in the human heart, challenging the very foundation of the epic journey. This was not a fringe complaint. Throughout the later Middle Ages, the culture of pilgrimage faced profound and growing criticism from both outside and within the church itself, revealing a deep tension between the external ritual and the internal faith it was meant to inspire. The most radical critiques came from movements branded as heretical, like the Lollards in England and the Waldensians in France. They saw the whole practice as a wasteful superstition, a physical distraction from the true spiritual work of prayer and moral living. Why walk 1,000 miles to see a dead man's bone, they argued, when you could feed a living hungry person on your own street? The Bohemian reformer Jan Hus gave voice to this widespread unease when he fiercely condemned what he called the idle wandering of pilgrims, arguing that the money spent on travel and souvenirs would be better used in acts of local charity. This was a powerful economic and ethical argument that resonated with many ordinary people who saw vast sums of wealth flowing out of their communities and into distant shrine towns. But the criticism was not only from the outside. Within the church, respected voices also raised alarms. The great Cistercian Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, a towering figure of 12th century monasticism, warned fervently against the moral dangers of travel. He feared that pilgrims, far from the stabilizing influence of home and parish, could be led into temptation, vice, and sin, ultimately damaging their souls rather than saving them. This internal anxiety about the corrupting influence of the road found its way into popular literature. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, while a celebration of storytelling, is also a masterpiece of gentle satire. His portraits of the worldly wife of Bath, the corrupt pardoner selling fake relics, and the smooth-talking friar all subtly question the motives and the spiritual integrity of those who took to the pilgrim trails. The ultimate rejection would come with the Protestant Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin argued forcefully that pilgrimage had no basis in Scripture. They taught that grace came through faith alone, not through physical journeys to holy sites, and they denounced the veneration of relics as a form of idolatry. This theological shift found its most dramatic physical expression in England under King Henry VIII. In a stunning act of symbolic destruction, he ordered the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury to be dismantled and the saint's relics burned. This was more than an act of plunder. It was a deliberate attempt to annihilate the very idea of a sacred destination, to prove that no journey on foot could ever bring a person closer to God. This rising chorus of dissent, from the sermon in the square to the king's command, was a clear sign of a world changing its mind. Yet even as the theological winds shifted, the deep tracks these journeys had left across the continent were already hardening into a new kind of pathway, one that would guide the future not of souls but of nations. The courtroom fell silent as the defendant raised his hand, not to swear an oath, but to display the leaden badge of St. James sewn onto his cloak. "I claim the protection of Pilgrim's law," he declared. In that moment, he was not merely a traveler from Gascony accused of a crime in Lombardy. He was a peregrinus, a person whose very status created a legal shield recognized across the fractured kingdoms of Christendom. This was one of the pilgrimage's most profound and overlooked legacies. The relentless river of humanity flowing across borders forced the creation of entirely new legal concepts, planting the seeds for what would one day become international law. At the heart of this was a revolutionary idea that a person, by virtue of their sacred journey, possessed certain inalienable rights that transcended the local laws of any lord or town they passed through. These rights included safe passage, protection from arbitrary violence, fair access to markets, and the ability to seek justice in specially designated courts. This legal status was a fragile bubble of universal rights in a world otherwise defined by rigid localism. How did this work in practice? It began with powerful spiritual movements. The peace of God and the truce of God were ecclesiastical decrees that sought to limit feudal warfare by declaring certain places, like churches, and certain people, including pilgrims, as inviolable. To harm a pilgrim was not just a crime, it was a sacrilege, an offense against God that could bring excommunication upon an entire region. This spiritual sanction provided a powerful, if imperfect, deterrent. As legal historian Harold Berman observed, the law merchant that governed bustling international trade fairs developed in part to handle the countless disputes between pilgrims and merchants from different regions. These were the first international commercial courts, where judges relied not on the local custom of Paris or Cologne, but on a common body of mercantile practice that was fair, fast, and universally understood. Pilgrims benefited directly from this system. They were often exempt from many of the arbitrary tolls that local lords imposed on travelers, operating under a form of sacred passport. If a pilgrim was cheated by a merchant or robbed by a bandit, they could seek redress in these special courts or in the even more powerful ecclesiastical courts of the Church, which claimed jurisdiction over all matters involving the faithful on their sacred journeys. This created a parallel legal universe that operated across national borders. Conflicts between pilgrims of different nationalities required new forms of diplomacy. A quarrel between an English knight and a French merchant on the road to Rome could not be settled by English or French law alone. It demanded a neutral, third-party mediation, often provided by a papal legate or a monastic order, establishing an early precedent for international arbitration. This need for cooperation led to formal treaties between states. A prime example is the agreement between the Byzantine Emperor and the Venetian Doge to protect and transport Latin pilgrims to the Holy Land. This was not merely a business contract, it was a bilateral accord that defined responsibilities, guaranteed safety, and established protocols for handling disputes, a clear precursor to modern international treaties. The pilgrimage road, therefore, became a vast, open-air laboratory for legal innovation. It tested the limits of local jurisdiction, championed the concept of universal human dignity based on a shared spiritual identity, and forced political enemies to collaborate. The legal innovations forged in the dust of these ancient paths would outlast the journeys themselves, creating a framework for a world where people, and eventually nations, could interact under a common rule of law. The Great Galley from Venice cut smoothly through the Mediterranean waves, its decks filled not with desperate penitents but with paying passengers. For a set price, a 15th-century pilgrim could now book a package tour to the Holy Land, complete with scheduled meals and a guaranteed berth. This was a far cry from the arduous, faith-testing treks of earlier centuries, and it signaled a profound transformation. The age of the classic medieval pilgrimage was drawing to a close, its decline driven by a powerful convergence of plague, politics, and a fundamental shift in human thought. The world had indeed changed, and with it the roads to heaven. First came the cataclysmic shocks that made the very idea of such a journey seem like a death wish. The Black Death of the 14th century wiped out as much as half of Europe's population in a few horrific years. In the shadow of such indiscriminate mortality, why risk a perilous voyage across continents when death could find you just as easily at home? Then, in 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre, fell to Mamluk forces. This was not just a military defeat, it was a door slamming shut. The land route to Jerusalem, already dangerous, was now effectively closed to most Europeans, severing the physical connection to Christendom's most sacred goal and leaving a generation of the faithful spiritually adrift. A new intellectual wind was also beginning to blow, one that questioned the value of external ritual. The rising philosophy of humanism turned the gaze inward, suggesting that true piety was a matter of personal conscience and intellectual cultivation, not a long walk to a distant shrine. Why seek God in a dusty reliquary abroad when you could find him through study and prayer in your own heart? At the same time, the emerging nation-state was flexing its power, increasingly viewing its subjects as taxable assets rather than free-ranging souls. Kings began to regulate movement more heavily, imposing passports and duties that made crossing borders a bureaucratic ordeal, slowly strangling the fluid, cross-continental movement that had defined the Pilgrim trails. We can see this shift in spirit vividly in the journey of the English knight Sir Richard Guilford in 1506. His chaplain kept a detailed account that reads less like a spiritual quest and more like a modern travel log, filled with complaints about bad weather, seasickness, and haggling with Venetian ship captains. This was a highly organized, commercialized operation, a far cry from the solitary, vulnerable trust in God that had characterized the pilgrim of 3 centuries before. The final, decisive blows were still to come. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century would outright ban pilgrimage in many regions, denouncing it as a popish superstition. And the invention of the printing press meant that spiritual texts, once only accessible at great libraries along the route, could now be read by anyone in their own home, making the journey for knowledge obsolete. Yet, even as the medieval model of pilgrimage faded into history, its immense influence was not vanishing. It was merely evolving, its deep, worn tracks ready to guide a new kind of traveler, one driven by curiosity and commerce rather than penance and prayer. A modern backpack rests against a weathered stone wall, its bright synthetic fabric a stark contrast to the ancient masonry. Beside it, a walking stick leans, and the owner, a woman from Seoul, checks a small shell-shaped app on her phone, confirming the next yellow arrow painted on the pavement ahead. She is one of hundreds of thousands who now walk the Camino de Santiago each year, a river of humanity that has returned to these old roads with a force that would astonish the medieval pilgrims who first carved them. This is not a reenactment of the past, but a vibrant, living tradition reborn for a new age, transforming these paths of penance into routes of personal quest. The resurrection began in earnest near the end of the 20th century. In 1993, UNESCO declared the routes of the Camino de Santiago a World Heritage Site, an official recognition that catapulted the ancient trail from historical footnote to global destination. This was followed by a wave of media attention, most notably the film The Way, which presented the journey not as a grim ascetic trial, but as an accessible, human story of transformation. Word of mouth did the rest, creating a self-perpetuating cycle where every returning pilgrim became an ambassador for the road. A scholar of modern pilgrimage captures the essence of this appeal, noting that the Camino provides a space for modern people to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with themselves and others. This is the core of the modern revival. For many, the pilgrimage is no longer about earning an indulgence or fulfilling a religious vow. It is a voluntary simplicity, a stripping away of the noise of contemporary life. The motivation is as diverse as the pilgrims themselves. You will find athletes seeking a physical challenge, tourists in search of an authentic cultural experience, and countless individuals navigating a life crisis, a career change, or profound grief. Consider the retired schoolteacher from Germany. She began her walk from St. Jean, Pied de Port, carrying not just a backpack, but the heavy weight of her husband's recent passing. The rhythmic, day-after-day motion of walking became a meditation. In the shared meals of the albergues, the pilgrim hostels that have replaced medieval monasteries, she found a ready-made community that asked no questions about her past, only offered companionship for the next day's stage. The Camino did not erase her loss, but it gave it a landscape and a path forward. This new pilgrimage economy has been a lifeline for rural Spain and France. Villages that were slowly emptying have found new purpose. Cafes, small grocery stores, and family-run albergues now thrive on the seasonal flow of walkers. Yet this very success has created a new challenge, the paradox of over-tourism. In the summer months, the main routes can become crowded. Booking a bed becomes a competitive sport, and the quiet reflection many seek can be harder to find. The ancient paths built for solitude and devotion now bear the weight of a modern phenomenon, a testament to their enduring and perhaps evolving power. This living legacy, walked by millions in sneakers instead of leather sandals, proves that the human need for a meaningful journey is as powerful today as it was 1,000 years ago. Harold Hardrada's journey to Jerusalem was no quiet penance. The future king of Norway, a giant of a man forged in the fires of Viking sagas, approached his pilgrimage as a military campaign. He fought his way across the Mediterranean, clearing the land route for other pilgrims and accumulating a fortune that would later fund his claim to the Norwegian throne. His time in the Holy Land transformed him from a mercenary into a Christian king, a legend he would carry back to the frozen north. He was not the only royal whose destiny was rewritten on the road. Centuries earlier, the Anglo-Saxon Queen Etheldreda performed a pilgrimage so profound it defied her royal status. She walked barefoot to the site where she would establish the great Abbey of Ely, a spiritual fortress that became a center of learning and power, its legacy enduring long after her death. For these rulers, the journey was a crucible that tempered their authority with divine sanction. Yet the pilgrimage's power was not confined to kings and queens. In 1520, a Spanish knight named Ignatius of Loyola arrived at the mountain shrine of Montserrat. He laid his sword and dagger upon the altar, swapping his soldier's attire for the simple robes of a pilgrim. This single night of vigil in a cave nearby ignited a spiritual fire that would eventually blaze into the Society of Jesus, the formidable Jesuit order that would shape global education and counter-reformation for centuries. How could a single journey redirect the course of a life so completely? The answer lies in the personal chronicles left behind. The English mystic Marjorie Kemp, a mother of 14, undertook pilgrimages across Europe and to Jerusalem, weeping and preaching publicly in a display of raw, emotional faith that often unnerved the clergy. Her book, Dictated Because She Could Not Write, is a startlingly intimate record of her spiritual struggles, considered the first autobiography in the English language. It gives us the unvarnished voice of a medieval woman, a voice pilgrimage alone made possible. Royal pilgrimages were also grand political spectacles. When Elena of Aquitaine accompanied her first husband, King Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade, she was not a passive companion. She led a contingent of her own vassals, her presence turning the armed pilgrimage into a complex diplomatic mission that would ultimately fail, but which forever marked her as a formidable political force in her own right. But pilgrims were not only seekers of God or power. They were also artists and scientists. The German painter Albrecht Dürer traveled to the Netherlands, his journey less about relics and more about networking with fellow artists and studying new techniques. His travel diary is filled with sketches of exotic animals and meticulous records of expenses, revealing the mind of a Renaissance man on a professional tour. Similarly, the Welsh cleric Gerald of Wales used his ecclesiastical journeys as a pretext for a grand scientific survey. He documented the natural world with a curious eye, questioning why Ireland had no snakes and recording the songs and stories of the people he met, creating an invaluable ethnographic record. From the farthest reaches of Europe, the Russian abbot Daniel traveled to the Holy Land in the early 12th century. His account was so precise, so rich with practical detail about the holy sites and the challenges of travel, that it became the essential guidebook for generations of Russian pilgrims, a spiritual blueprint that connected the Russian Orthodox faithful directly to Jerusalem. The Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta, who performed the Hajj, captured the universal pull of such journeys when he wrote, "Traveling leaves you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller." This was the ultimate transformation. These famous feet, from queens and knights to mystics and artists, walked the same dusty paths as millions of unknown travelers. Their individual quests for grace, knowledge, or power created ripples that spread across continents, proving that the grandest historical currents often begin with a single, determined step. A perfect circle, drawn on vellum, placed Jerusalem at the very heart of the world. This was the medieval Mappa Mundi, a map not of miles but of meaning, where every city and river existed in relation to its spiritual center. For the pilgrim, the world was not a collection of countries, but a sacred landscape to be traversed, and their maps reflected this profound belief. The journey from a simple list of towns to a visual representation of the soul's geography marks a pivotal moment in how Europe saw itself. The most famous of these, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, is less a navigational chart and more an encyclopedia of faith. Here, the Garden of Eden sits at the top, the Pillars of Hercules mark the edge of the known world, and the city of Jerusalem is a perfect circle at the dead center. Scattered across its lands are tiny illustrations of strange beasts and, crucially, the major pilgrimage sites from Rome to Santiago. A cartographic historian explains that medieval maps were as much about theology as geography. They were sermons in parchment, designed to illustrate humanity's place in a divine plan, with the pilgrim's road literally leading to salvation. Before these beautiful abstractions, the pilgrim's primary tool was the itinerary, a starkly practical document. These were not maps with pictures but lists. They would state, for instance, that from the town of A to the town of B is a day's walk, and that you will cross a river with a certain bridge and see a hill with a distinctive tree. Directions were given through a sequence of landmarks, a verbal map painted in the mind of the traveler. The Peutingers table, a medieval copy of a late Roman road map, served this function for centuries. It is a long, narrow scroll that distorts the shape of lands to clearly show the network of roads, the distances between stations, and the locations of hostels, functioning as a Roman roadmap that never truly fell out of use. The church was the great curator of this geographical knowledge. Monasteries along the routes were not just shelters, they were information hubs where travelers exchanged news about bandit activity, road conditions, and the best places to find clean water. This controlled flow of information ensured that the primary mental map of Europe remained one defined by its spiritual arteries, reinforcing the centrality of Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago. We see this systematized in the Liber Sancti Jacobi, the Book of St. James, which contains one of the world's first comprehensive travel guides. It doesn't just list stops on the Camino, it describes the lands and the people a pilgrim will encounter, warning of treacherous river crossings and praising the virtues of the good bread in some regions. Today, we can see these ancient networks with a clarity that would astonish a medieval cartographer. Using Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, historians and archaeologists can layer old itineraries over satellite imagery, precisely reconstructing the lost path. This digital cartography reveals how these routes clung to the safest ridges, forded rivers at their most shallow points, and connected settlements in an organic web. To trace these lines on a modern map is to see the continent's skeleton, the connective tissue that bound it together. This was not merely a network for moving people, but a channel for the flow of artistic genius, as the designs for grand cathedrals and the styles of illuminated manuscripts traveled the very same road. The sheer scale of the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela was designed to overwhelm. After months of travel, a pilgrim would step from the bright Spanish sun into the cool, shadowy vastness of the nave, their gaze pulled upward by the relentless march of rounded stone arches. This was not a unique sight, but a familiar one, an architectural echo of dozens of other great churches they had passed on their long journey from France. The pilgrimage routes did not merely move people, they functioned as the primary arteries for the great artistic styles of the age, carrying the visual language of Romanesque and later Gothic architecture across the entire continent. Art historian Henry Fosselin perfectly described these paths as the great international style highways, where faith and form traveled together. At the heart of this movement were the itinerant guilds of stonemasons and sculptors. These highly skilled craftsmen were the medieval equivalents of global consultants, moving from one massive cathedral building site to another, carrying portfolios of designs etched not on paper but in their minds and hands. They followed the pilgrim streams because that was where the money and the ambition were concentrated, where wealthy bishops and abbots were competing to build the most magnificent shrines. The very layout of these pilgrimage road churches was engineered for the mass movement of people. The most important innovation was the ambulatory, a curved walkway that extended behind the high altar. This allowed a continuous flow of pilgrims to circulate around the sacred shrine, viewing the relics without disrupting the main church services. To accommodate the thousands of visitors, naves grew longer and taller, and walls grew thicker to support the immense weight of the stone barrel vaults overhead. The exterior of these churches became a Bible for the illiterate. The grand sculpted portals, like the famous one at the Cathedral of Autun, depicted dramatic scenes of the Last Judgment, with souls being weighed and demons claiming the damned. This was theology carved in stone, a powerful sermon that every pilgrim could understand, regardless of their language or their ability to read. We can trace this flow of artistic influence like a map. The robust, earth-bound Romanesque style, with its rounded arches and massive walls, flowed from the great monastic centers of Burgundy and Languedoc in France directly down the Camino into Spain. Look at the Church of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, a key stop on the route, and you see the same architectural DNA in the distant Cathedral of Santiago. The evidence is often breathtakingly direct. The intricately carved capitals in the cloister of Moissac Abbey in France, with their frenzied, expressive figures, share a striking family resemblance with those in the Spanish monastery of San Juan de la Peña, suggesting that a team of sculptors, or at least their pattern books, made the journey across the Pyrenees. Later, when the Gothic style was born in the Île-de-France region with its pointed arches and flying buttresses, it did not stay confined. It too raced along the pilgrimage highways, carried by a new generation of masons who had learned to make stone seem weightless, to build walls of stained glass that glowed like divine light. This shared visual language, repeated from Toulouse to Tournai, created a unified aesthetic across Europe, a common dream of heaven built in stone that made every pilgrim feel at home in a distant land. And just as these paths carried a shared vision, they also carried a unified sound, a musical tradition that would harmonize the voices of a continent. The same Gregorian chant echoed at dusk in the abbeys of Burgundy and the hostels of Navarre, a universal soundscape for a continent on the move. For a weary pilgrim, the familiar rise and fall of Latin psalms in a Cluniac monastery was a profound comfort, a sonic homecoming in a distant land. This was not an accident. The pilgrimage routes became the primary channels for the spread and standardization of sacred music, creating a shared sonic identity for Latin Christendom. The need for a universal liturgy in international hubs like the hostel at Roncesvalles was practical. Pilgrims from Germany, England, and Italy all needed to worship together. This practical necessity drove the widespread adoption of the Roman Rite and its accompanying chant, gradually suppressing countless local variations. A musicologist notes that the great abbeys on the pilgrimage roads were conservatories of chant. These monasteries were the nodal points in a vast network, training singers in a unified style and sending them out along the sacred roads. The very foundation of this system was the Schola Cantorum in Rome, the papal choir school that for centuries trained the finest singers, who then carried the authentic Roman chant northward into Francia and beyond, their voices a living library of sound. But the music of the road was not confined to the church. Pilgrims themselves sang as they walked, their voices marking time on the long marches. In Spain, they learn the cantigas, the poetic songs in Galician Portuguese celebrating the miracles of St. James. On the road to Jerusalem, they lifted their voices in Latin hymns like O Roma Nobilis and the aching Jerusalem Mirabilis, their melodies weaving a thread of collective yearning across the landscape. The most stunning evidence of this musical flourishing is the Codex Calixtinus, the same 12th century guidebook for the Camino. It contains a complete polyphonic mass for the feast of St. James, one of the earliest surviving examples of such elaborate multi-voiced music. This was not simple chant. It was a complex, soaring composition, proving that the pilgrimage could inspire artistic innovation on a breathtaking scale. The feast day itself was a spectacular multimedia event. The cathedral at Santiago would be filled with the scent of incense, the visual splendor of gold and vestments, and the overwhelming sound of the Mass, sung by a trained choir in the new polyphonic style. For the pilgrim who had walked for months, this sensory overload was the climax of their journey, an earthly glimpse of the heavenly choir. This shared sonic landscape, from the simplest walking song to the most complex polyphony, did more than just guide worship. It harmonized a continent, giving a diverse multitude of travelers a common voice and a shared emotional rhythm, making the external journey of the feet a mirror for the internal transformation of the soul. The stars over the Pyrenees were a cold, brilliant dust scattered across a velvet sky, and in their silent light, a pilgrim named Gerald felt the weight of his old life simply fall away. He wrote in his diary of a profound peace that night, a connection to God so direct it needed no church, no relic, and no priest. This was the pilgrimage's hidden destination, a landscape not of cathedrals but of the human soul. The external journey across mountains and rivers was always a mirror for an internal one, a physical metaphor for the soul's arduous progress toward divine grace. The path was a script for a spiritual drama, and every pilgrim was both the actor and the audience in their own transformation. This profound inner process followed a distinct, almost universal rhythm. It began with a calling, a deep, restless urge that made the familiar comforts of home feel like a prison. Answering it required a painful separation, leaving behind family, status, and security to step into the vulnerable identity of a wanderer. Then came the long, liminal stage of the road itself, a betwixt and between existence where the old rules no longer applied and every day was a test. In this sacred space, the pilgrim faced trials that were as much psychological as physical. The exhaustion, the hunger, the fear of bandits. Each hardship was designed to strip away the ego, to sand down the rough edges of a worldly identity until only the raw, essential self remained. The medieval mystic Thomas Kempis captured this perfectly in his book The Imitation of Christ, writing, "Whoever wishes to understand fully the words of Christ must try to pattern his life entirely on that of Christ." The pilgrimage was the ultimate attempt to live that pattern, to imitate Christ's suffering and wandering in the hope of achieving his peace. Modern psychology sees this ancient ritual as a classic rite of passage. The pilgrim voluntarily enters a state of liminality, a threshold space where they are neither who they were nor who they will become. In this fragile, open state, the combination of solitude and forced community works a strange magic. A pilgrim could spend hours walking in silent introspection, alone with their thoughts and the rhythm of their footsteps, only to find themselves that evening sharing a simple meal and their life story with a complete stranger. This dance between isolation and fellowship broke down emotional defenses, creating a unique environment for personal change. The rituals of the road gave this fluid experience a solid backbone. Kissing a specific stone, drinking from a holy well, or reciting a prayer at a designated wayside cross, these acts were not empty habits. They were psychological anchors, moments of focus that channeled the overwhelming experience into manageable, meaningful steps. For some, the journey unlocked extraordinary spiritual states. Marjorie Kemp's autobiography is essentially a map of her inner world during her pilgrimages, filled with visions, uncontrollable weeping, and intense conversations with Christ and the saints. Her spiritual experiences were so powerful and public that they constantly brought her into conflict with ecclesiastical authorities, yet she never doubted their reality. The pilgrimage had given her a voice and a context for a mysticism that would have been stifled in her ordinary life. The climactic arrival at the shrine, then, was often an anti-climax. After months of struggle, the destination itself could feel strangely quiet. The real transformation had already happened along the way. The challenge was the return home. After the intense, purpose-driven life of the road, the return to a mundane existence could be devastating. We would now recognize this as a form of post-pilgrimage depression. The world had not changed, but the pilgrim had, and reconciling the new self with the old life was the final, and often the most difficult, leg of the journey. This intimate map of the soul, charted through fear, hope, and revelation, was the most personal legacy of all, proving that the greatest borders crossed were not between kingdoms, but within the human heart. The great pilgrimage routes now lie quiet beneath modern highways and rail lines, their stones smoothed by 1,000 years of footsteps. Yet their legacy is not lost, it is simply woven into the fabric of our world. We have traveled together along the lost journeys that carved the spiritual and political contours of Europe, from the crowded streets of Rome to the windswept plains of Santiago. We have seen how these epic pilgrimages were far more than simple acts of devotion. They were the dynamo of the medieval world. They generated economic wealth in the markets of Leon and the banking houses of Lombardy. They spread knowledge through the translated texts of Toledo and the wandering scholars on the Via Francigena. They forged a common culture in the shared songs of the Camino and the familiar sculptures of the great pilgrimage churches. And they laid the groundwork for international law in the protected status of the pilgrim and the merchant courts of the trade fairs. The paths walked by millions of faithful feet became the channels through which Europe defined itself, both in opposition to the outside world and in its own internal cohesion. As the historian Patrick Geary reminds us, the Middle Ages created Europe. Let this journey inspire you to look at the map of Europe not just as a collection of nations, but as a palimpsest of these ancient, sacred routes, where the ghost of the Via Francigena still whispers beneath the French autoroutes and the Camino's yellow arrows still guide the modern seeker. Perhaps it will even move you to embark on a journey of your own, to walk in the footsteps of history and discover what personal transformations await you on the road. Share your thoughts on these lost journeys in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this exploration, subscribe for more deep dives into the forces that shaped our world. That hollow in the stone step of Canterbury Cathedral is not the result of erosion alone. It is a memory carved by millions of kneeling pilgrims, a physical testament to a faith so powerful it could wear down solid rock. The legacy of these epic journeys is not confined to history books. It is encoded directly into the European landscape, waiting just beneath our feet for anyone who knows how to look. The pilgrimage routes are one of Europe's largest and most continuous archaeological monuments, a sprawling, open-air museum of devotion. You can walk the same path today. In the English countryside, deep, green ruts known as holloways mark the course of the Via Francigena, sunken so far into the earth by centuries of foot and hoof traffic that they feel like secret passages through time. In Spain, the magnificent Romanesque bridge at Puente la Reina still carries travelers across the river Arga, its very name meaning the Bridge of the Queen, who commissioned it for the Pilgrims of the Camino. And across the Alps, the great St. Bernard Hospice, founded in the 11th century, continues its mission of shelter, now welcoming modern hikers with the same sacred hospitality it offered medieval wanderers. To read this landscape, you simply need to learn its language. Notice a church dedicated to St. James, even in a small village in Germany or France. It almost certainly sits on a branch of the Camino, a spiritual waymarker for the faithful. The names of towns and landmarks tell their own stories. Any place containing pont, like ponds in France, signals a crucial river crossing. A name with hospital, like Hospital de Orbigo in Spain, reveals the site of a long-vanished hostel for weary travelers. Modern waymarking systems have simply formalized this ancient guidance. The famous yellow arrows of the Camino and the cockwheel St. Jacques shell symbols often follow the exact same tracks established 1,000 years ago, proving that the most efficient path for a pilgrim on foot remains the most efficient path today. Ongoing archaeological work constantly deepens our connection to these travelers. Recent excavations at a cave in the French Pyrenees uncovered medieval graffiti scratched into the wall, a simple name and a cross left by a pilgrim seeking protection before the mountain crossing. This is not just data, it is a personal signature from the past, a voice calling out from the darkness. To stand in that cave is to feel the tangible presence of someone who walked this same ground, driven by hopes and fears not so different from our own. These physical remnants, from worn steps and sturdy bridges to a name scratched in stone, remind us that the maps forged by faith are not lost. They are simply waiting to be rediscovered, a hidden layer of history etched permanently into the soul of a continent.